I heard my mom calling me. She died 3 years ago. Let me ask you something. You're alone at home. Could be night, could be the middle of the afternoon, doesn't matter. And suddenly, you hear your name. With a voice. With that specific tone. The exact way only one person used to call you. And when you turn around, when you answer, when you walk toward the room the sound came from, there's no one there. And you let out that nervous little laugh, stand there frozen for a few seconds and tell yourself, oh, it was the wind. It was the TV. I imagined it. But you know what's funny? You couldn't sleep that night. You kept your phone in your hand, lights on, and every single time the house made a different sound, your heart went from 0 to 100 in less than a second. Because deep down, and be honest with me right now, deep down, you know it wasn't your imagination. What if I told you there's a documented case? Witnesses, police investigations, physical evidence. That starts exactly like that? A man hearing the voice of his dead mother calling his name. And what he found out afterward changed the lives of everyone involved in this story. Some lives for the worse. And one life, well, that life never came back to what it was before. Stay with me, because this video is going to be different. My name is Nick, and I spend way too much time thinking about stories like this one. I heard my mom calling me. She died 3 years ago. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button and leave a like if this video helps you. Today I'm going to tell you the story of Daniel Mercer, a 34-year-old man from Portland, Oregon, who in the fall of 2019 started hearing the voice of his mother, dead for 3 years, calling his name, inside his house. But here's what most people don't realize. This story is not about ghosts. It's not about hallucinations. And it's not about a broken man who lost his mind after losing his mom. This story is about a cult. A murder that was never officially ruled as one. A religious group so deeply embedded in the Pacific Northwest that local authorities looked the other way for over a decade. And a secret that Daniel's mother tried to take to her grave, but couldn't. Because the dead sometimes don't stay quiet. Let's get into it. So let me paint you the picture. Daniel Mercer was by all accounts a pretty unremarkable guy. And I mean that in the best possible way. He worked as a structural engineer for a mid-sized firm in Portland. He had a modest apartment in the northeast side of the city. He cooked his own meals, went to the gym 3 times a week, called his sister on Sundays. He was the kind of guy who had figured life out, more or less. But 3 years before our story begins, in 2016, Daniel's mother, Ruth Mercer, died. And the official cause of death was a heart attack. She was 61. She had a mild history of cardiovascular issues. There was nothing suspicious on the surface. The death certificate was signed, the funeral was held, and the world moved on. Daniel grieved. His mother had been the center of his family. His father had walked out when Daniel was 7, and Ruth had raised him and his younger sister, Claire, completely on her own. She worked 2 jobs through most of their childhood. She never missed a school play, never missed a birthday. She was, as Daniel described her to friends, the only person who made me feel like I wasn't alone in the world. So when she died, something in Daniel went quiet. He didn't spiral into addiction or self-destruction. Nothing dramatic like that. He just got very still. Very internal. He went to work, he came home, he watched TV, he went to sleep. And the weeks turned into months, and the months turned into a year, and then 2. He was functioning. But he wasn't living. Now, here's where I want you to pay attention, because this detail is going to matter later. In the last year of her life, Ruth Mercer had started attending a church. Not a traditional church. Not a Baptist congregation or a Catholic parish. A community she'd found through a neighbor, a group that called itself the Order of the Renewed Covenant. They met twice a week in a converted warehouse on the outskirts of Portland. They had their own pastor, their own rituals, their own interpretation of Scripture. Daniel knew about it. Ruth had mentioned it casually, the way you mention a new hobby. I've been going to this Bible study group, Daniel. It's really beautiful. The people are so warm. He hadn't thought much of it. His mother had always been spiritual. She kept a rosary on her nightstand, she prayed before meals, she read devotionals in the morning. Finding a community seemed natural, healthy even. But there were two things Daniel noticed in that last year that unsettled him, though he buried the feeling at the time. The first, his mother stopped talking about her personal life. Completely. Every phone call became surface level. How's work? How's Claire? Isn't the weather strange this time of year? Ruth had always been the type to share everything. Her worries, her dreams, her memories. Suddenly there was a wall. The second, the last time Daniel saw his mother in person, about 6 weeks before she died, she grabbed his hand at the door as he was leaving and held it a beat too long. And she said, "Daniel, if anything ever happens to me, look inside the blue box." He laughed it off. "Mom, nothing's going to happen to you." She smiled. But her eyes didn't. He never asked about the blue box. He never found it. And then she was gone. All right. So now we're in October 2019. 3 years after Ruth's death. Daniel is living alone in his apartment. It's a Tuesday night. He remembers this specifically because he'd just gotten home from a particularly brutal day at work. He ordered Thai food. He was watching something forgettable on Netflix. It was around 10:45 p.m. And he heard it. Daniel. His name. His mother's voice. Clear as anything. Not muffled, not distant. Right there, somewhere in the apartment. He turned off the TV instantly. Sat completely still. Now you might be thinking, okay, Nick, the guy was tired, he was half asleep, he imagined it. And look, that was Daniel's first thought too. He told himself exactly that. He finished his food, he went to bed, he forgot about it. But it happened again 3 nights later. Same voice. Same clarity. This time he was in the kitchen. He heard it from the direction of the hallway. Daniel. He walked down the hallway. Bathroom, empty. Bedroom, empty. Closet, empty. Windows locked. He stood in the middle of his apartment at 11 o'clock at night, heart pounding, and tried to be a rational man about it. He called his sister Claire the next morning. And here is where it gets really interesting. Because Claire didn't laugh. She didn't tell him to see a therapist. She went very quiet on the phone, and after a long pause she said, "Daniel, I've been hearing her too." Claire lived 40 minutes away in a suburb called Beaverton. She had heard her mother's voice twice in the past month. Once while she was putting her kids to bed, once while she was alone in her car in a parking lot. Both times just her name. Ruth's voice. Nothing else. Now, 2 adults living separately, both grieving the same woman, both hearing the same voice. Tragic but explainable. Except, the following week, Daniel got a phone call from a number he didn't recognize. The man on the other end introduced himself as Pastor Gerald Holt, the leader of the Order of the Renewed Covenant. Ruth's church. He said he was calling to check in on the family. That he'd been thinking about Ruth. That her absence had left a profound void in their community. Daniel was polite. Thanked him. Was about to hang up. And then Pastor Holt said something that made Daniel's blood go cold. "Your mother left something for you at our fellowship hall, Daniel. She left it before she passed. She specifically asked that we hold on to it and give it to you when the time felt right. We think the time is right." Daniel asked what it was. "A blue box," said Pastor Holt. "She said you'd know what it meant." Okay, let's pause here for a second, because I want you to really sit with what just happened. Daniel's dead mother told him, 6 weeks before she died, to find the blue box if anything ever happened to her. He never found it, never asked about it, buried it in the back of his mind along with all the other grief he didn't want to deal with. And now, 3 years later, after he starts hearing her voice, a man he's never spoken to calls him out of nowhere and says, "We have it." That is not a coincidence. That is something else entirely. Daniel drove to the fellowship hall that Saturday. The Order of the Renewed Covenant operated out of that converted warehouse I mentioned. A large, nondescript building in an industrial area of outer southeast Portland. No sign out front. Just an address. Daniel almost drove past it twice. Inside, though, was something entirely different from what the exterior suggested. The space had been transformed into what could only be described as a sanctuary, vaulted ceilings with hanging wooden crosses, rows of chairs arranged in a semicircle, candles everywhere, a massive tapestry on the far wall depicting a scene Daniel didn't immediately recognize. It wasn't from any Bible illustration he'd seen before. The people were warm. Immediately, unnervingly warm. A woman offered him tea. A man shook his hand with both hands. Children ran between the adults' legs. There were maybe 40 or 50 people in the building. Pastor Gerald Holt was nothing like Daniel expected. He was in his late 50s, slight, soft-spoken, with the kind of face that made you think of a librarian or a high school biology teacher. Glasses. A cardigan. He hugged Daniel like he'd known him for years. "Your mother talked about you constantly," Holt told him. "She was so proud of you." He brought Daniel to a small office off the main hall and placed the blue box on the desk between them. It was a simple wooden box, painted blue, the kind you find at craft stores. Latched shut with a small metal clasp. Holt slid it toward Daniel and folded his hands. "She left this for you. We haven't opened it. It belongs to you." Daniel asked why they'd waited 3 years to contact him. Holt smiled. "Because Ruth asked us to wait until you were ready." "How did you know I was ready?" Another smile. "We prayed about it." Now, here is what most people don't realize about high-control religious groups, and I want to lay this out clearly because it's central to everything that follows. Cults, and I'm going to use that word deliberately even though groups like this one reject it furiously. Cults are extraordinarily sophisticated in their management of information and emotion. They don't recruit with threats or overt manipulation, at least not at first. They recruit with warmth, with belonging, with the sense that you have been chosen, that you have been found, that there is a community waiting for you that has always understood you in a way the outside world never did. They are experts at identifying grief, at identifying loneliness, at identifying people who have a hole inside them that they don't know how to fill. Ruth Mercer had been a widow for nearly 30 years when she found the order. She'd raised her children alone. She'd worked herself to exhaustion. She was devout but had never found a church community that truly felt like family. And then she found these people. And they made her feel like she'd come home. Daniel took the box home without opening it in front of Pastor Holt. He didn't know why. Some instinct told him to wait. He drove back to his apartment, sat at his kitchen table, and opened it alone. Inside, a folded letter in his mother's handwriting, a USB drive, and a photograph, a group photo of about 30 people standing in front of that warehouse, taken sometime in the last year of Ruth's life. She was in the middle of the back row, smiling, and around her neck, something Daniel had never seen her wear, was a medallion. A circular pendant with a symbol on it he didn't recognize. He read the letter first. I'm going to read you excerpts from this letter as Daniel described it, because he shared portions of it publicly, and because what it contains is extraordinary. Ruth wrote, "Daniel, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and I wasn't able to tell you what I need you to know while I was still here. I tried many times. I couldn't find the courage. I'm sorry for that. You deserved to know sooner. When I joined the covenant, I believed with everything in me that I had found something real, something holy. And some of it was real. The love I felt from those people in the beginning, that was real, or it felt that way. But over time I began to see things that frightened me. Rituals that weren't in any scripture I'd ever read. Teachings about the dead that no church I knew of would ever condone. Gerald told us that those who had passed through death were still present among us, that they could be called back, that their voices could be used as instruments of the Spirit. I know how this sounds. I know you're reading this and thinking your mother lost her mind. Maybe I did for a time. But Daniel, I watched a woman die in that building. Her name was Margaret Cho. She was 42 years old. She had a heart condition that the elders knew about. They told her that medicine was a failure of faith. She died during a prayer vigil in the spring of 2015. They told her family it was God's will. They told the authorities she'd had a cardiac event at home. I was there. I know what happened. And I know too much now, and I'm afraid. On the USB drive you'll find copies of documents I was able to take from the Covenant's records room over several months. Financial records. A list of members, current and former. Correspondence between Gerald Holt and a network of affiliated groups in 4 other states. And, Daniel, I need you to be prepared for this, recordings. I love you more than you will ever know. Be careful. And please, don't go back to that building alone. The letter was dated 6 weeks before Ruth's death. Daniel sat at that kitchen table for a very long time. Then he plugged in the USB drive. Okay. So here's where I have to be precise with you, because this part of the story is where things move from disturbing to genuinely dangerous. The USB drive contained, as Ruth described, financial records, membership lists, interorganizational correspondence. But the recordings were something else. There were 14 audio files. Each one was labeled with a date. The earliest was from 2014. The most recent was from 4 months before Ruth's death, early 2016. The recordings were made on a small digital recorder that Ruth had apparently smuggled into services and private sessions. The audio quality varied. Some were muffled, some were remarkably clear. Daniel listened to all 14 in a single night. And what he heard built, one recording to the next, into something that he described later as watching a building burn down in slow motion. The early recordings were, on the surface, unremarkable. Prayer sessions, testimonials from members, Pastor Holt's sermons, which were eloquent, emotionally sophisticated, and built on a theology that blended evangelical Christian language with something older and stranger. References to the veil, to those who walk in the between space, to the idea that death was not an ending but a transition into service. By the third recording, from 2015, the language had shifted. Holt was speaking to a smaller group. His voice was different, less pastoral, more commanding. He was describing a practice he called the calling, in which members who had lost loved ones could, through prayer and specific ritual, hear the voices of the deceased. He presented this not as grief counseling or spiritual comfort, but as literal communication, as the dead returning through the veil to deliver messages. The Lord does not take our beloved ones away from us, Holt said on the recording. He transforms them. He gives them new purpose. And through our covenant with Him, we are the instruments through which that purpose is made manifest. When your loved one calls your name, and they will know that it is not imagination. It is not grief. It is a summons. Daniel stopped the recording. He sat there in the dark of his apartment. And he thought about his mother's voice calling his name. He thought about Claire's voice going quiet on the phone. He pressed play again. The 6th recording was the one that documented Margaret Cho's death. Not the death itself, but the days leading up to it. Ruth had recorded a private conversation between herself and another woman in the congregation, both of them expressing fear about Margaret's declining health, about the elders' insistence that she stop taking her heart medication, about the prayer vigils that were lasting through the night and leaving Margaret visibly weakened. Gerald says the medication is blocking the spirit from healing her, the other woman said on the recording, her voice low and frightened. He says if her faith is strong enough. Her faith is the strongest of any of us, Ruth interrupted. This isn't about faith. Margaret Cho died 11 days after that recording was made. The 12th recording, from late 2015, documented something that Daniel could only describe as an exorcism. A young man, maybe 20 years old, screaming in what sounded like physical pain while members of the congregation prayed over him in overlapping voices. Holt's voice cutting through the chaos with calm, methodical instruction. The session lasted, Daniel checked the timestamp, 1 hour and 43 minutes. He never found out who the young man was. He searched membership lists, cross-referenced what he could. Nothing. And the 14th recording, the last one, Ruth's voice, alone, speaking directly into the recorder. No background sound. She must have recorded it at home. My name is Ruth Eleanor Mercer. I am recording this on March 3, 2016. If something happens to me, I want it known that I do not believe my death will be natural. I believe the elders of the covenant are aware that I have been collecting these recordings and documents, and I believe I am in danger. I am placing this box in Gerald Holt's keeping because I believe that is, paradoxically, the safest place for it. They will not search what they already control. I am trusting that God will find a way to bring it to my children. Daniel. Claire. I love you. I'm sorry. Find out what happened to Margaret Cho. And find out what happens to the people who leave. Ruth Mercer died of an apparent heart attack 17 days later. All right. Let's talk about what Daniel did next. Because this is where the story gets complicated in a very human way. He didn't go to the police immediately. I know your first instinct is why not? And look, I understand that reaction. But put yourself in his position for a second. He had a USB drive full of audio recordings made covertly in a private religious organization. He had a handwritten letter from his dead mother expressing fear but no explicit accusation. He had financial documents he couldn't fully interpret. And he had exactly zero physical evidence connecting the order to any crime. Going to the police with that, without preparation, without context, without a lawyer? He risked being dismissed entirely, or worse, tipping off Holt before anything could be done. So Daniel did something smart. He called a journalist. Sonia Park was an investigative reporter at a Portland alternative weekly that covered local politics, crime, and community affairs. She had previously reported on a property dispute involving a different religious organization in the area, and a mutual friend connected them. They met at a coffee shop. Daniel brought copies of everything. Sonia listened for 2 hours without taking notes, just listening, watching Daniel's face, watching his hands. When he finished, she said, "I'm going to need some time. But I believe you." What Sonia found over the following 3 months, through public records requests, interviews with former members, and contact with relatives of people who had left the order, was a pattern. Not a single dramatic revelation. A pattern. Former members described a process that researchers of high-control groups call coercive persuasion. The gradual dismantling of a person's outside relationships, the replacement of family bonds with community bonds, financial contributions that began voluntarily and became increasingly compulsory, and an escalating demand for loyalty that made leaving feel not just socially devastating but spiritually catastrophic. Holt had taught his congregation that leaving the covenant was a rejection of God's covenant, that those who left were not merely choosing a different path but actively inviting spiritual destruction into their lives. 3 former members that Sonia interviewed had left the group between 2012 and 2018. All 3 described the same experience: immediate shunning by every person they knew inside the group, harassment through anonymous phone calls and letters, and, this detail appeared in all 3 accounts independently, hearing voices. Voices of deceased family members. Calling their names. One woman who left in 2014 told Sonia, "I knew it wasn't real. I knew Gerald had been talking to us for years about the calling, planting the idea that the dead could reach us. I knew he'd primed us to hear it. But knowing that didn't make it stop. I heard my father's voice in my house for 8 months after I left. I ended up in therapy for 2 years. This is the psychological mechanism at work, and it's documented, it's studied, it's real. When a high-control religious group spends years conditioning members to expect supernatural auditory experiences, to interpret them as communication from the divine or from deceased loved ones, those experiences can persist long after a person leaves. The brain has been rewired to produce them. But here's what most people don't realize: Holt wasn't just exploiting grief. He was manufacturing it. Deliberately, systematically cultivating in his congregation a relationship with death and loss that made them perpetually dependent on his framework to make sense of their own minds. The order of the renewed covenant was, at its core, a grief cult. and Daniel Mercer's mother had tried to document it, and had possibly died for it. The question of Ruth's death required its own investigation. Sonia contacted the Multnomah County Medical Examiner's office and requested a review of the death record. She found nothing irregular in the paperwork. The attending physician had signed off on natural causes. The certificate had been processed without complication. But she found something else. The physician who signed Ruth's death certificate, a Dr. Alan Veach, had 2 former patients whose deaths had also been attended by members of the order. Both deaths, cardiac events. Both death certificates, signed by Veach. Sonia ran Veach's professional history and found that he had been a licensed physician in private practice since 2001, with a history of minor disciplinary notes. Nothing disqualifying, nothing alarming. But she also found that Dr. Alan Veach was a listed member of the Multnomah County chapter of a regional interfaith community organization. An organization whose listed leadership included, among others, Pastor Gerald Holt. Daniel confronted Holt. "I want to be clear, he was advised not to. Sonia told him not to. His sister told him not to. The attorneys they'd consulted told him not to. He went anyway." He drove to the warehouse on a Wednesday evening. He knew from the schedule Ruth had written down in her notes that Wednesdays were small group prayer nights, fewer people, and that Holt was typically in his office beforehand. He walked in without calling ahead. The woman who greeted him at the door recognized him from his previous visit. She smiled, reached to hug him. He stepped past her politely and asked for Holt. Holt came out of his office, and when he saw Daniel's face, something shifted in his expression. Not fear exactly. More like recognition. Like a man who has been waiting for a knock at the door and finally hears it. He brought Daniel into the office and closed the door. Daniel placed a single printed page on the desk between them. It was a transcript of the recording in which Ruth had said her name, the date, and her belief that she was in danger. Holt looked at it. Then he looked up at Daniel. And he said, calmly, with that same soft voice, "Your mother was a troubled woman in the last months of her life. We did everything we could to support her." Daniel said, "Did you know she was recording your sessions?" "I suspected. We all carry burdens, Daniel. Your mother carried fear. It distorted her perception of what we were doing here. Margaret Cho." Pause. "Margaret died in God's grace. She died because you told her to stop taking her medication. I advised no such thing. Faith and medicine are not enemies. If Margaret received that message, it was not from me." Daniel stood up. He said, "I've given everything to a journalist and to an attorney. If my mother was killed, and I believe she was, I will find out. And I will burn this place down." He meant it metaphorically. He walked out. Holt said nothing as he left. 3 days later, the warehouse that housed the Order of the Renewed Covenant suffered a significant fire. The official cause, electrical fault. The building was badly damaged. Most of the internal records, physical records, paper files, printed correspondence, were destroyed. The digital records Ruth had taken were, thankfully, already in multiple hands. Okay. Here's where I'm going to be honest with you about what the story resolved and what it didn't. Sonia Park published her investigation in early 2020. The piece ran in the Alternative Weekly and was picked up by several regional outlets. It documented the coercive practices of the order, the deaths of Margaret Cho and 2 other members, the relationship between Holt and Dr. Veach, and the fire. The Oregon Department of Justice opened a preliminary inquiry. The medical board opened a separate review of Dr. Veach's practice. Veach surrendered his medical license in 2021 as part of a negotiated agreement with the board. He was not criminally charged. Holt was never charged with any crime related to Margaret Cho's death or Ruth Mercer's death. The investigation into the fire was closed without charges, inconclusive evidence. The Order of the Renewed Covenant dissolved. Most members dispersed. Some found their way to affiliated groups in other states. The voices stopped for Daniel about 4 months after he opened the blue box. He's never heard his mother's voice again. Claire stopped around the same time. Neither of them can fully explain that. In an interview he gave in 2021, Daniel said something that I keep coming back to. He said, "I used to think the voices were a warning, like she was trying to reach me from wherever she went. I don't know if I believe that, but I know that if I hadn't heard them, if I hadn't been scared enough to call Claire, if Claire hadn't gone quiet the way she did, I never would have gone to that warehouse. I never would have taken the box home. I never would have known what she tried to tell me. So maybe it doesn't matter whether the voices were real. Maybe what matters is what I did because of them." All right, let's land this plane. Here's what I want you to take away from Daniel's story, because it's bigger than one family, one cult, one warehouse in Portland. Groups like the Order of the Renewed Covenant exist everywhere. They are in every major city and dozens of small towns. They don't announce themselves. They don't look like what you picture when you think of a cult. They look like community. They look like belonging. They look like the thing you've been missing. And they are extraordinarily, specifically good at finding people who are grieving. Because grief makes us porous. It opens us up. It makes us hungry for meaning, for connection, for any framework that tells us the loss we're living with is not the final word. The psychological exploitation of grief is not spiritual. It is not holy. It is predatory. And the auditory experiences, hearing the voices of the dead, are real neurological events that can be deliberately induced through sustained conditioning. Pastor Holt didn't invent this. High-control groups have been using these techniques for decades. Create the expectation, normalize the experience, and then position yourself as the only one who can interpret what it means. Now, you might be sitting there thinking, "Nick, I heard a voice. I heard my mom, my dad, my brother, my best friend who's gone. Does that mean I'm in a cult? Does that mean someone is manipulating me?" No, absolutely not. The vast majority of people who experience these things are simply grieving. The brain, under the weight of profound loss, is capable of extraordinary things. Hearing a loved one's voice is one of the most commonly reported and least discussed aspects of human grief precisely because we're afraid it means we're going crazy. It doesn't. It means you loved someone and your mind hasn't finished letting go. What matters, what Daniel's story teaches us, is what you do next. Do you sit with the experience, let it be what it is, let it carry you toward the people who love you? Or do you let someone else tell you what it means? Ruth Mercer left a blue box because she knew she might not make it out. She trusted that love, even filtered through fear, even speaking from beyond a wall she couldn't cross, would find a way. It did. That's the thing about the people we lose. They don't disappear entirely. They live in the choices we make because of them. In the courage we didn't know we had until we needed it. Daniel heard his mother calling. And he listened. My name is Nick. If this video meant something to you, hit that like button, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need it. I'll see you in the next one.